Hi everyone, Suzanne here. I hope you're all well and welcome to Sew Custom. Today's video, as you will have already seen from the thumbnail, is how I sewed up this little number. So if you're interested in seeing that, then let's get started.
Starting with the fabric, this is a chambray, quite lightweight and quite crisp, good for a project like this, and on to the cutting out. This is my skirt. I have two layers of folded fabric underneath, notches at the fold line top and bottom, and a couple of notches at the side seam to mark the bottom of my zip. So the first thing to do here is to add tier number 1 to this piece. So just like before, I have two layers of folded fabric underneath my pattern piece, a couple of notches at the top and bottom of the fold line, and I have a little bit of prep work to do here before I can add it to the top piece of my skirt, and that prep work comes in the form of gathers. So I'm going to run two lines of long stitches right along that top edge, starting with a back stitch, using the longest stitch length on my machine, sewing within my seam allowance and pulling my threads to finish. And I'll repeat that one more time, moving my needle a little bit towards the right and stitching the whole way across. So now to gather that fabric down, I'm holding on to the top two threads, leaving the threads on the bottom as they are and pushing the fabric along. And once it's all gathered, this is how it looks. Just measuring it up here with the top of my skirt to see if I've gathered enough. And I have, so tying off my threads. And to make it a little bit easier to sew, I'm just pressing those gathers flat. And now that that's done, I can join the top part of my skirt to this first tier. My fabric is right sides together, lining up my notches, and ready to stitch. Back stitching to start, at my 1 centimeter seam allowance, and back stitching to finish. I'll finish that edge and give that seam a good press, which you can see here. And now that that's done, I'm ready for tier 2. Again, just like before, I have two layers of folded fabric underneath my pattern piece, a notch at the fold line on top, and now the same thing again here. I need to gather this tier down before I can add it to the top part of my skirt. So off camera, I ran my first line of stitches, and here just finishing off that second line. I've gathered that fabric down, measured it up with the top part of my skirt, tied off my threads and pressed my gathers. And here, just laying it over the top, my fabric is right sides together and ready to stitch. Back stitching to start, at my 1 centimeter seam allowance, and back stitching to finish. Just like before, I finished that edge on the overlocker, press that seam, and this is how it looks. So I have both of my tiers attached. The next thing to do is to add the waist piece. My fabric underneath both pattern pieces here is on the fold. I have a notch at the top and bottom of the fold line on both pieces. So my waist pieces for both front and back are slightly smaller than the top part of my skirt. So before I can join these two pieces together, I need to reduce the length of the waist at the top of my skirt. So to do that, I'm just popping my finger at the back of my foot, catching that fabric as it comes through, using the longest stitch length on my machine. And what this will do is evenly reduce the length of the waist without giving me gathers. So now that that's done, I can add my waist piece, My fabric is right sides together, lining up my notches and ready to stitch. Back stitching to start, at my 1 centimeter seam allowance and back stitching to finish. I finished my edge, pressed out that seam, and this is how it looks. So that's the front of my skirt complete. I've repeated that entire process again for the back, which you'll see a little bit later, but for now, setting the skirt aside to work on the bodice. My fabric underneath is on the fold. I have a notch at the top and bottom of the fold line, and I have 2 darts here, snipping notches at the bottom of the dart legs, and popping pins in at the point. Marking with my chalk pen where those pins pierce the fabric. And drawing in my dart legs. Pinning the point of the dart first of all, making sure the notches at the bottom of the dart legs are lined up, popping a pin in through the chalk line on top, out through the chalk line on the bottom and back up through again. I'll finish those off camera and ready to stitch. Starting with a back stitch at the bottom of the dart legs, following that chalk line the whole way up and pulling my threads to finish. I'll tie off those threads and press out my darts off camera, which you can see here. So super happy with these. So now my front bodice is ready to be joined to my back at the shoulders. My fabric underneath is on the fold. I have a notch at the top and bottom of the fold line and a couple of notches to mark my dart legs. Popping a pin in to mark the point of the dart, marking where that pin pierces the fabric, and drawing in my dart legs. I'll pin those off camera and ready to stitch. Back stitching to start, following that chalk line the whole way up and pulling my threads to finish. I've tied off my threads and given my darts a nice press, and this is how they look. And now that that's done, I'm ready to join my back to my front at the shoulders. My fabric is right sides together and ready to stitch. I finished that edge on the overlocker and pressed out that seam. And now that that's done, I'm ready for the frill that goes around the neckline. I have a notch at the centre of both pieces, and I've had to cut both of these slightly differently just because I didn't have enough fabric. The one on the right, my back piece, is cut on the fold, and the one on the left, my front, is cut in 2 pieces. So the first thing to do here is to join those 2 front pieces together. My fabric is right sides together and ready to stitch. Back stitching to start, at my 1 centimeter seam allowance and back stitching to finish. I finished that edge on the overlocker and pressed out that seam. And now that that's done, I'm ready to join the front to the back at the shoulders. My fabric is right sides together and ready to stitch. again, that seam has been finished and pressed. So I just have a couple more things to do to this piece before I can add it to my dress. The first of which is to finish the hem. And for this piece I've decided on a double folded hem. So folding that fabric in underneath by about half of my hem allowance, pressing, folding again by the same amount and pressing. I'll finish that off camera. And ready to stitch. Back stitching to start. Sewing right along that inner crease edge, using a little bit of a longer stitch length here. Taking this nice and gently. Pivoting at my corners. And finishing with a back stitch. So I've given the whole thing a good press. And now the last thing I have to do in terms of prep work for this piece is to gather down that edge. So just like I did on the skirt before, I'm going to run 2 lines of stitches, starting at one shoulder and finishing at the other. So I've already gathered down one side. So for the other, just holding on to those top 2 threads and pushing the fabric along. And once it's all done, this is how it looks. I've tied off my threads, pressed down the edge of the gathers, and here, just laying that frill on top of my neckline, wrong side of frill to right side of dress, lining up my corners, my notches and my shoulders, and pinning into place. Ready to stitch. Starting at one shoulder with a back stitch, sewing here about 1 millimeter or 2 inside my seam allowance, making sure those gathers are all nice and flat, pivoting at my corners, and finishing with a back stitch. So that's my frill all attached. So now to finish the neckline on this dress, I've decided on a facing. My fabric underneath is on the fold. I have a notch at the top of the fold line. Exactly the same thing for the front. And I want to give the neckline just a tiny bit more crispness. So to do that, I'm using a super lightweight interfacing here and just pressing it into place. I've added that same interfacing to the back, and now that that's done, I'm ready to join these 2 pieces together at the shoulder. Starting and finishing with a back stitch. So I finished that edge and pressed out that seam, and while I was at the overlocker, I've just ran that bottom edge through it also, just to tidy it up. And now that that's done, this piece is ready to be joined to the neckline of my dress. So just laying it over the top, right sides together, lining up my notches, lining up my corners and pinning, and ready to stitch. Backstitching to start, this time sewing at my 1 cm seam allowance, pivoting up my corners, taking this nice and gently, trying to make sure my edges are lined up the whole way around, and finishing with a backstitch. So I just need to finish that edge and clip into my corners, which you can see I've done here. And now in preparation for understitching, I want to press the facing away from the dress, but make sure that that seam allowance in underneath is butted up against the facing. I finish that off camera and ready to stitch. So I'm stitching here through the facing, through that seam allowance in underneath. I'm about 1 millimeter or 2 away from the frill, using a little bit of a longer stitch length. And what this understitching will do is to help that facing sit nice and neat in underneath without showing too much on the outside. Backstitching to start and backstitching to finish. So that's at a good press, and this is the result. Happy with that. So now to close up the armholes, and to do that I'm going to use the burrito method. So currently my facing and my bodice are wrong sides together. I need them to be right sides together in order to sew them. So I'm just rolling up the fabric on one side, setting it on top of the shoulder on the other side, flipping the fabric out from underneath, making sure my roll is nice and tight. And now my fabric is right sides together. So I've just pinned that into place and ready to stitch. Backstitching to start at my 1 cm seam allowance and backstitching to finish. So I'll finish that edge off camera, and here just pulling the whole thing through to the right side. So popping my hand in between the bodice and the facing, catching hold of the roll and pulling the whole thing through to the right side. And once it's had a good press, this is how it looks. Super happy with this. And now to repeat that whole process for the second shoulder. So rolling the fabric on one side up, setting it on top of the other shoulder, flipping that fabric out from underneath, and laying the bodice fabric on top. So I've stitched that up off camera, and here just showing again, pulling that whole thing through to the right side. So that's my armholes all closed up, my facing attached around the neck and my ruffle sandwiched in between. So now that that's done, I'm ready for my skirt. So just laying my bodice over the top, lining up my notches and pinning, and stitching here at my 1 cm seam allowance, backstitching to start and backstitching to finish. So I'll run that edge through the overlocker and press out that seam, which you can see here. So this is how my front is looking so far. And now to do exactly the same thing on the back. So that's my skirt attached both on the front and back. Now to add the zip. So before I can do that, I have a little bit of prep work to do. So just laying one side seam over the other. My fabric is right sides together. Lining up my seams, lining up my edges and pinning. And I'm going to sew here from the underarm point down to my zip notch using the longest stitch length on my machine. Once I get to my zip notch, I'm going to back stitch and sew with a regular stitch length right down to the hem. Starting with a back stitch. So coming down to my zip notch here, back stitching, adjusting my stitch length and sewing right down to the hem. Finishing with a back stitch. So I just need to press that seam open, which I'll do off camera. And now that that's done, I'm ready to tack my zip into place. And for this dress, I'm using a concealed zip, and I'm just lining up the teeth of the zip with the seam I've just sewn. And now just hand tacking the zipper tape to the seam allowance on both sides. So now that that's all hand tacked into place, I can remove those machine tacking stitches. So that's that all done. I can now open my zip and more easily sew it into place. So using my standard zipper foot, I'm placing my needle as close to the teeth as I can get and stitching the whole way down. Starting and finishing with a back stitch. I'll do exactly the same thing on the other side, and this is how it looks. And from the underside, happy with that. So now just to finish the zip and protect my skin, I'm going to add a little bit of facing here. So I've just cut myself a rectangle of fabric and I'm just going to attach it to the seam allowance on one side, using a little bit of a longer stitch length, sewing within my seam allowance, starting and finishing with a back stitch. So that just needs a final press, and this is how it looks from the inside and the out. Nice and neat and tidy. So now the last thing I have to do to finish the zip is attach the facing to my seam allowance at the underarm point. So I'm just folding that facing down, pulling that top part of the zip out of the way. My fabric is right sides together and ready to stitch. Taking this nice and gently, back stitching to start and to finish. So I just need to trim down that corner, turn everything through to the right side and press, which you can see I've done here. Super happy with this. So that's my zip all complete, and I just have a couple more things to do to finish this dress. The first of which is to close up the other side seam. So just laying one side over the other, my fabric is right sides together and ready to stitch. Back stitching to start at my 1 centimeter seam allowance and back stitching to finish. And off camera I've pressed that seam open, which you can see here, and now the last thing I have to do is just to finish the hem. So off camera I've pressed and folded in exactly the same way as I did the ruffle before. And here, just stitching along that inner crease edge, using a little bit of a longer stitch length. Starting and finishing with a back stitch. And that just needs a press, which I've went ahead and done off camera, and this is the result. And with that, this little dress is complete. So I've got my square neckline, my facing all attached, everything nicely understitched, got those double darts, my waist piece, my zip and its facing, and then those gorgeous tiers of the skirt. And from the outside, that beautiful ruffle, my darts, my zip, and then the waisted skirt. And this is what it looks like on. The fit of this is so nice. I absolutely love those double darts. It's my first time trying this and I could not be more pleased with how it turned out. I love the ruffle around the neck, the shape of the neck. I like the waist. I like how it nips in. The tiered skirt is so nice. I like the length, I like the volume. And if you've been following along over on Instagram, you might have seen a couple more versions of this. I've been playing around with fabrics. But anyway, super happy with how this has turned out.
So I really hope you guys enjoyed the video. I hope you found it useful. If you did, give it a thumbs up. If you've not yet subscribed, please do. And I shall see you on Friday. Until then, I hope you have a fantastic week. Bye folks!